Alright, so in this tutorial, we are going to study about for loop, while loop, and do while loop. So let's start with for loop. A for loop is used when the number of iterations is known beforehand. So what does that mean? So it means that if we have to execute a certain piece of code n number of times and we know the value of n, then we can basically use for loop. So the syntax of for loop includes initialization part, condition, and increment decrement. So what is initialization? So basically it runs only once at the start. Okay. And then what is the condition? So before running every iteration, it will evaluate for the condition. Okay. And the loop runs as long as the condition is true. And then the third part is increment decrement. So what it will do is it will basically update the value of loop variable. So the syntax looks like for initialization, then comes the condition, and then comes increment decrement. Now let's run a practical example for loop so things will be more clear. So here we have a for loop in which we have initialized a variable I is equal to 1, and then we have a condition I should always be less than or equal to 5, and at the end we are incrementing the value of I with 1. So with every run of this for loop, the value of I would be incremented by 1. So initially the value of I is 1, so it will check whether 1 is less than equal to 5, which is true. So it will basically print for loop 1, and then it will increment the value of I to 2. Then similarly it will evaluate whether 2 is less than equal to 5, which again is true. So it will print for loop 2. So this thing will go on until the value of I reaches 5. So at that time it will see whether 5 is less than equal to 5, which again is true. So it will print for loop 5, and then it will increment the value of I to 6. Okay, so then it will check whether 6 is less than equal to 5, which becomes false now. So in this case, it will not print for loop 6. So the loop will only run from I is equal to 1 to I is equal to 5. So let's run this program. And there you go. So it is basically printing for loop 1, 2, 3, 4, and for loop 5. Now coming to while loop. So while loop is almost similar to for loop. It's just like we prefer using while loop when we don't know the total number of iterations. Okay. So the syntax of while loop looks like while condition, and if this condition is true, it will execute the code, and as soon as the condition becomes false, it will stop executing this code. So let's see the example of while loop. So in this example we have a variable I and we have initialized it with 1. Okay, and then we have a while loop which has the condition I should be less than equal to 5. And if it is true, it will go inside and it will print while loop and the value of I. And then we are incrementing the value of I by 1. Okay. So initially I is equal to 1, and this condition is true because 1 is less than equal to 5. So it is going to print while loop 1. And similarly to what we saw in for loop, this condition will be true until the value of I turns out to 6. So till 5 this condition will be true, and as soon as we go inside this loop for I is equal to 5, at the end it will increment the value of I to 6, and then when it goes back to this condition, it will check whether 6 is less than equal to 5, which is false. So it will stop going inside this while loop, and it will basically print while loop from 1 to 5. So let's run this program. There you go. You can see that while loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is printed on the console. Now coming to do while loop. So in do while loop, basically it is guaranteed that the execution is done at least once, okay, even if the condition is false. So the syntax of do while loop is do, then we can have certain code inside the do block, and then we have while condition. So the difference between while loop and do while loop is, in do while loop, the code is executed at least once, even if this while condition is false. So we'll see this with the help of an example. All right, so consider this example of do while loop. Here we have initialized value of I to 1, and then we have this do while loop, and inside this do we are just printing do while loop and the value of I, and at the end we are incrementing the value of I by 1, and the while condition basically will evaluate whether the value of I is less than equal to 5. So if we run this program, it will also run 5 times as we saw for loop and while loop. So let's run this first. Okay, so you can see that do while is printed from 1 to 5. Now you guys might be wondering, like, what is the difference between while loop and do while then? Like, why do we need do while loop if while loop was also serving the same purpose? So the only difference is the while loop will not run even once if the condition is false. But in case of do while loop, even if this while condition is false, it will run at least once. So let's make the value of I as, say, for example, 6. Okay, so the condition becomes false straight away because 6 is not less than or equal to 5. So ideally it should not print anything if it is a while loop, but since it's a do while loop, even though the condition is false, it should run this do at least once. So it should print do while 6 because the value of I is 6. So let's run this. There you go. You can see that do while loop 6 is printed in the console. So I hope for loop, while loop, do while loop, all the three loops which are very commonly used in Java are here to you. Do subscribe my channel Code Rider. Thanks for watching.